Good morning. Welcome to another 21st briefing. We're going to look at the week ahead in Trenton and the legislative calendar. Most of the action is going to happen or all the action is going to happen on Monday, tomorrow, and Thursday, June 4th. There's nothing going on June 5th. So before we get into the bills, one thing I want to be clear about is the context around this. So these bills are in sort of earlier stages. So when we bring these bills up, they're on calendars, they're in committee meetings in the Assembly and in the Senate. And when we say something's moving through the committee, it doesn't mean that it's passing. A lot of these bills get hearings, but don't go any further than that. And we cover them at this stage because it's where public input actually matters. So there's been a little bit of confusion when we talk about this stuff. It's not like this stuff is going to pass tomorrow. This is the point where if you have kind of an issue or a concern, or if you feel a bill needs to be improved, that you reach out to your representative, because this is where your feedback probably has the most weight. So we're going to spend most of our time covering kind of four general areas today. EMS comes up again. That's been something we've been talking about the last 2 weeks. The EMS thing is going to be a little different today, though. School funding, which has always been on the radar the last 30 years, housing, and transit again. So let's go into our set of deep dives. In the first priority is EMS, and this bill that we're going to talk a little bit about is a bit different than the one that's been stirring up some controversy. This one is S1772, and it is sort of related. It's kind of in the same orbit, and it's going to require the Department of Health's Office of Emergency Medical Services to develop a statewide EMS plan. And it starts with a question. Does your town have paid EMS coverage during the day, or does it depend on volunteers? Most residents don't know the answer, and that's part of the problem. EMS in New Jersey is uneven. And so you have a mix of paid staff and professional coverage around the clock, and other towns where they depend on volunteers. And there may be some gaps during the day when volunteers are at work. That may not be true for all towns. And so there might be some mutual aid agreements, these departments dealing with call volumes, costs that they might have a hard time trying to cover. And the system might look a little different depending on where you live. And this is about getting a statewide picture, an assessment of where coverage is strong and where it's maybe buckling. So the bill is going to require the Office of Emergency Medical Services to develop kind of a coordinated plan with short and long-term goals, regional planning, posting of the plan on the site. We kind of talked about the assembly version, I think, of this last week. It goes a little bit further. It also calls for an inventory of resources across the state so that it can assess how the system is working, come up with performance metrics, a schedule or a timeline on how those metrics are going to be achieved, costs, crisis intervention, support services for EMS staff. So it's a whole bunch of stuff that kind of connects to the concern around the bill that is looking, or that everybody's sort of worried about replacing, volunteer EMS with. But that's not this bill. So there is a benefit to this bill in that it could provide finally a clear public picture of what the statewide EMS coverage looks like, where it's working, where it's not. And again, the trade-off or the cost is that, a plan isn't the same as a solution. And there's also a concern that whatever plan does get developed, becomes sort of a precursor, or maybe a stage for the more concerning bill to take place, where this becomes sort of this justification. So that this is something that on its face looks really, really good, as long as it doesn't get political, as long as it stays to the data, and as long as that there's not like this intention right from the start to use this as a way of saying, okay, let's move away from the volunteer stuff and let's bring everybody into sort of paid professional services, because that's something a lot of communities are going to rail against due to cost, especially when they have highly effective EMS services in their area, like we do, um, in sort of our neck of the woods, where New Providence, Berkeley Heights, Summit. So the question is really simple. If EMS is an essential service, and it is, who's going to be responsible for making it work all the time, everywhere? And can we do that? And we can, I think, with this sort of mix of volunteer and paid, sort of this sort of quilt of paid and volunteer services, town to town, county to county. So the second big bucket, or the second area that we're going to focus on, is school funding, like from Alabama. On Monday, tomorrow, the Senate Education Committee is scheduled to talk about two school funding bills, S4118 and S4330. That's S4118 and S4330. And these are more discussion items, but they're worth looking into a little bit. S4118 is, man, this is a long one. Fairness for school districts and development restricted areas. Basically, the problem is the state's told some towns that they can't develop, or they're limited in how they can develop due to environmental protections. And that's a fair choice. And I think, many towns in New Jersey would celebrate that limit. But the consequence is that these towns have smaller tax bases and can't grow the way other towns can. But they still have schools. The schools still have costs. So this bill would provide additional aid, state aid, to the districts with towns that are part of these like restricted areas. So again, the argument is pretty clear. If the state's limited in how much a town can grow, it has some responsibility for the consequences of that, limitation. The trade-off, obviously, is that special aid formulas create winners and losers. So if more money goes to development to restricted areas, it has to come from somewhere, the state budget, from other districts. It's not a free fix. And that causes me a little pause, because honestly, enrollments across the board are starting to go down, and the logic behind this bill makes a lot of sense. But then there's also this other part that as enrollment starts going down, and we start seeing some of these other costs, we've had this whole health benefit thing blowing up over the past few months. Like, we can't delay the inevitable, in terms of, like, do some districts really have to downsize as a result of just economic realities? That doesn't necessarily mean that the school district is going to go down. It just has to right size. So there's pros and cons with that bill. S4330 is separate, and it would prevent reductions in aid for certain districts that already are set to lose aid and are below adequacy, spending adequacy, and don't have enough levy or tax levy authority to close the gap between their required local fair share, or their required local share, and then the last year or the prior year's general fund tax levy. And so that bill is really about stability. Districts build their budget around projections, and cuts that they're not expecting or blindsiding them can mean tax increases, cuts to programs, reserves being spent down. Again, the trade-off is that, holding some districts harmless shifts pressure to other parts of the system. So, the big question is that we keep creating these like fixes for school funding, and each kind of addresses a problem, but none of them really fixes not just the underlying formula. Everybody's like focused on this formula, but there are some real spending issues with districts. And anybody who's kind of followed us is going to just kind of roll their eyes on this. But the enormous amounts of money that we're spending on things like security theater, administration. you know uh, there gets to a point where it feels like we're missing the elephant in the room with some of this stuff on, redistribution, and all that's fine. I mean, I'm all for well-funded schools, but some of this money is just not going to places that are necessary, and it doesn't feel like anybody at the state level is talking about it. In fact, in one of these bills, I think as we're going along, we're going to start expanding security for non-public schools, but we'll get to that in a minute. Uh, the next priority is housing, ADUs, property taxes. And the first bill that we're going to look at there is S1786, which deals with ADUs. We've talked about these before. And just think about a garage apartment, basement apartment, backyard. I don't know, those tool sheds that people live in now, or whatever they're called. I don't know if you ever saw it, but like these like shipping containers that they convert to offices, like 10K, you could get one of those. I think you have to put in your own electricity. Anyway, we're talking about ADUs. So this bill, S1786, is going to push municipalities to allow them, and would limit, and I think we've talked about this bill in the past as well. It would limit some local restrictions. It would make ADUs a permanent use as of right on lots with existing single family or two family homes. And agencies, municipalities would have to act on ADU applications within 60 days or it's approved. So we've covered this. Um, it's an important, there is an important carve out you need to know about, which is that it would not apply to municipalities that already have an ADU ordinance uh, on or about, January 1st, 25, and still has that in effect. So if municipalities have already done this, I think there's a little bit of an advantage there because they have something on the books that they've created or carved out. But for those that don't, this is sort of on the radar. And the case for ADUs, as we've said before, is it creates housing without all these massive developments. It can help our seniors age and still live in New Jersey. It can give families with, generations more flexibility to stay within their properties. So I'm a big fan of the idea of ADUs, but there is a case against it. It compromises local zoning control, things like parking, density, sewer, all that stuff. Municipalities are going to argue that the state's overriding decisions that should be local, which has always been a pressure point in New Jersey is local control. So it's a genuine tension. But looking at the pros and cons, you can kind of make your own decision. The next bill on to watch under this area of housing is S3103, which would dedicate about half of the revenue the state gets from additional fees and taxes on real property transfers over 1 mil to the New Jersey Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And this is about kind of establishing a more consistent, more predictable funding stream for affordable housing. And the trade-off is that it's going to lock this funding in for a specific reason, which creates less budget flexibility. It's basically saying you're going to take this money and you're going to do it with only this. You're going to use it only for this, which kind of is hands off. And, New Jersey hasn't been great in even following the rules on that. So there's been a lot of pots of money that are, hey, it's only for this, but the state uses it anyway. So maybe that's not so much of a problem, but it's kind of inherently a problem. The other issue is that it relies on like these high value transactions. Those are the things that tend to be very market sensitive. So when times are good and you know people are kind of selling $1 million properties, um, maybe that works. But these aren't the folks that are necessarily going to need affordable housing. So the last priority is transit accountability. And the Assembly on June 1st, Monday, the Assembly Transportation and Independent Authorities Committee is going to consider A5064, which is going to make New Jersey Transit put out certain performance-related info. And the more interesting thing in this bill that tends to get buried is the Amtrak adjustment. So New Jersey Transit trains run on tracks that are shared and in some cases completely controlled by Amtrak. And so when there's delays, it's not always clear whether it's a transit issue or an Amtrak issue, and riders don't know who to blame or yell at. And A5064 will let you know who to be angry with, because it would require New Jersey Transit to publish monthly on-time performance and mean distance between failure, which shows the same numbers again adjusted for Amtrak-related issues. So you get two versions: raw performance and the numbers with Amtrak's that controls for Amtrak's sort of burden in that. So it lets riders know how much of the delay problem belongs to New Jersey Transit and how much of it is sort of outside that sphere. And it's a bit more of an accountability tool than almost anything New Jersey Transit's been required to put out before. The rest of the bill covers rail cancellations, the causes, and the causes are broken down into 5 categories, including Amtrak issues, staffing shortages, weather, uh, unpreventable incidents, whatever that means, infrastructure and equipment problems, carryovers from prolonged delays. So the benefit obviously is consistent, uh, regular, plain language, public data on how the system is performing. Of course, there's always a trade-off. Data does not fix the problem. We can publish every single thing that exists, but the aging equipment, staffing, and all that stuff um, doesn't get resolved with a report. But it matters. It's good. It's actually an important first step. I mean, public transparency is critical. So this data can actually put public pressure in the right spots to get some of this stuff moving. So not something you know we should I think anyone's really against. And then so there's a bunch of other areas that we're going to cover really quick. So those were the 4 key areas. Flooding and infrastructure data on June 1st. Assembly, Science, Innovation, and Tech hearing a set of bills on flooding and stormwater technology. And so that involves like a dashboard for flood, rainfall, river level, sewer capacity, a smart stormwater sensor. It's a pilot program. Kind of a very local, hyper local text alert system for severe weather, AI flood prediction and mapping tools. Those are on A3078, A3081, A3087. It's an acknowledgement that flooding is becoming a really, big problem in New Jersey. And, you'll have some people that argue that it's climate change, others that will argue it's overdevelopment. It's really both. But the case for this is real. Better data on this helps towns and residents, um, you know, sort of deal with this issue as it happens. Uh, and so, obviously the question is just like with the one before, data does not fix problems, but it could certainly inform the public and municipal governments on the scope of the problem and how urgent it is. Climate Superfund and environmental infrastructure. So, kind of related. The Assembly Environment and Solid Waste Committee, A3735. That's what it's going to be talking about, the Climate Superfund Act, along with a bunch of infrastructure funding bills for fiscal year 27. A735 is going to make certain fossil fuel companies pay into a DEP fund for climate adaptation and resilience projects. Things like flood protection, stormwater upgrades, roads, bridges. And, New Jersey has big climate and infrastructure costs. Right now, taxpayers are paying or covering all of it. And the bill tries to bring some of that burden over to companies that are behind some of the emission issues. Obviously, the argument is always going to be, liability fights, cost calculations, the fear that, yeah, you're going to be going after these companies, but ultimately they're going to pass this on to the customer in their energy pricing. So it ends up being the little guy that pays for it anyway. The infrastructure bank bills, A5192, A5193, A5194, and ACR 151 aren't as out there or dramatic, but they're practical. They fund loans for environmental infrastructure, the hazard mitigation program for the next year. Going back to data centers, man, this shows up like every week. Here we're going to look at A4. So the Assembly Telecommunications and Utilities Committee, three bills. A4096 is going to make data center owners submit semi-annual water and energy use reports. A3980 is going to require electric companies to develop grid modernization plans, and A4801 deals with protections for large load customers. So the common theme here is AI, cloud, data centers. As they expand in New Jersey, the grid is getting taxed significantly. Um, and whether, we have to ask whether the cost of this, uh, is it really fair that, um, residential and folks in apartments and all that end up paying the bill for that impact on price as these big data centers take massive amounts of this off. So I don't think it's not a quiet issue now. It's not the loudest issue in the AI debate, but it will. It's a big theme in why a lot of towns are pushing back. We're moving on to consumer protection. June 4th, Assembly Consumer Affairs Committee, four bills, A5110. It's going to prevent sellers from charging a surcharge when somebody uses a debit card. A5048, that we had that. This is the forever chemicals, PFAS. It's going to prevent that from happening in apparel containing. You can't sell it, make it, distribute certain apparel containing it. And it's going to that ban or that prohibition is going to begin like 2 years after the bill, if the bill become, after the bill's effective date, if it gets passed. A5084 is the animal cell. Man, this is weird. The animal cell cultivated food labeling bill. if if the if the food contains cell cultivated meat or other cell cultivated ingredients, it has to be labeled. Obviously, better transparency on what you're eating is important. But man, people have been eating hot dogs for. I'm not saying hot dogs are this, but but it's it makes sense. A1982 requires businesses that offer text-based customer service chats to provide a transcript to the customer on request. Most companies are doing that anyway, but this, I guess, would force the issue. So the benefit to those is clearer information, fewer surprises. Non-public school nursing and security. This is where we were talking about. This is what I was talking about at the very beginning. So the Senate Education Committee has S4260 and S4336 on the June 1st agenda. S4260 would create a pilot program for non-public nursing services in certain counties. And S4336 would allow state aid that's not used unexpended to be used for non-public school nursing and security services. And so obviously, I think, obviously students in non-public schools need basic health um, services provided. The big question is around security, which is it's that category has become very questionable and very expensive in New Jersey. And now we're finding even more reasons to spend money on this growing, booming industry that really hasn't shown any real results. The whole security cottage system within education. Um, there's a really interesting bill on public meetings. The Senate Community and Urban Affairs is looking at a bill that's going to require public participation to be allowed as a component of public meetings. It sounds kind of obvious. It sounds like something towns should be doing and school boards should be doing all the time, but the legal requirement is actually important because even in towns where public participation is written in stone in their own locals, uh, you have governing bodies that still treat it as optional or manage it in ways that make it really hard for people to actually participate. I have to look a little bit more into this bill because I think one thing we need to push for is to require school boards and municipalities across the state to allow for Zoom access. Um, I mean, there's so many things that can improve with public meetings. Forcing, you know, municipalities and towns to put their public meetings on YouTube and open up transcripts, uh, to not block commentary on recorded meetings of public meetings. So there's a lot of room for improvement here. So a lot of what we covered today sounds kind of technical, but they're important. And it's the same handful of questions that we ask all the time: who pays, who benefits, and in this case, who gets the data, who's accountable? Is it Amtrak? Is it NJ Transit? What are you really eating? And really, there are a lot of good planning bills. They make sense. But are these plans going to really lead to solving problems? Are some of these plans being used to sort of preemptively justify a policy agenda that um, may not actually be in the best interest, or is it a genuine attempt at looking at the big picture to genuinely resolve it? So that's it. Hope you guys have a great rest of the week. We'll see you next Sunday.